The fluorescent bulb above my head flickered like a dying heartbeat as I woke up at 6:30 in the morning, the same time I'd been waking up for 40 years of nursing shifts. But instead of preparing for a day of helping people heal, I was staring at concrete walls that wept with moisture in what used to be a storage room. How does a 68-year-old woman end up living like a prisoner in her own home? The space measured exactly 12 feet by 10 feet. I'd paced it off so many times I could walk it in my sleep. The ceiling hung so low that when I stood near the furnace, I had to duck my head or risk hitting the heating ducts. No windows, no natural light. Just 4 concrete walls painted institutional white, sometime in the 1980s, now stained with rust marks and water damage. The only illumination came from that single fluorescent tube that hummed constantly, a mosquito-like buzz that had become the soundtrack to my exile. The air was thick with the smell of cleaning chemicals stored in the utility closet bleach, ammonia, fabric softener mixed with the persistent odor of mildew that no amount of dehumidifying could eliminate. Every breath tasted metallic, like sucking on pennies. The concrete floor was always cold, even in summer, seeping chill through my slippers and into my bones. At night, the water heater kicked on every 2 hours with a mechanical groan that jerked me awake, while the washing machine's spin cycle made the walls vibrate like we were inside a spacecraft preparing for takeoff. I sat on the edge of my narrow twin bed, the same bed David had used in his college dorm room 20 years ago. With its sagging mattress and metal frame that squeaked every time I shifted position, the sheets were clean but smelled like the basement, damp and forgotten. Above my head, I could hear Samantha's designer heels clicking across the hardwood floors I had personally selected 15 years ago, each step sharp and purposeful. Then came David's heavier footsteps, the soft thud of his work boots crossing from the kitchen to the front door. They were discussing their day, their plans, their lives that apparently had no room for me anywhere but down here in the dark. Did you remember to call the contractor about the master bathroom renovation? Samantha's voice drifted down through the heating vents, clear as if she were standing next to me, already done. David replied, "He'll start next week. Should take about 3 weeks to finish. 3 weeks to renovate their bathroom." I've been asking for 3 months for someone to fix the dripping faucet in the basement utility sink, the one that kept me awake with its steady ping, ping, ping into the metal basin, but apparently that wasn't a priority. I pulled my threadbare robe tighter around my shoulders, the same robe I'd worn when David was small. Soft blue terry cloth now faded to gray and shuffled to the small mirror I'd hung on the concrete wall next to my makeshift dresser. The woman staring back looked like someone I barely recognized. Her gray hair was flat and lifeless from sleeping on a pillow that perpetually smelled like cardboard storage boxes. Her brown eyes, once bright with purpose and determination, seemed dim and hollow in the sickly fluorescent light. Deep lines had etched themselves around her mouth. Not from laughter, but from months of pressing her lips together to keep from screaming. But as I looked closer, adjusting the mirror to catch better light, I saw something else lurking behind the exhaustion and defeat. Something that Samantha, in all her careful calculations about my supposed helplessness, had failed to notice or account for. I saw Eleanor Martin, not just David's mother, the convenient label that had somehow become my entire identity. Not just the old woman who'd been pushed into the basement like an unwanted piece of furniture. I saw Eleanor Martin, the woman who had survived being widowed at 28, with a small child and no family support, who had worked double shifts in hospital emergency rooms for 20 years, who had built a life from absolutely nothing with her own determination and 2 capable hands. Eleanor Martin, who still owned every single square inch of the house above my head. Eleanor Martin, whose name was on the deed, the insurance policies, and the bank accounts that had paid for every improvement, every repair, every monthly bill for the past 15 years. Eleanor Martin, who had been biding her time. I touched the mirror with one finger, tracing the reflection of my face, and whispered to the woman looking back at me, "Maybe it's time they remembered exactly who you are." From upstairs came the sound of the front door closing, then the garage door opening and Samantha's BMW purring to life. David's truck followed a moment later, leaving the house silent except for the ever-present hum of appliances and the drip from that broken faucet. I was alone, as I had been every day for the past 3 months, in a house that felt more like a mausoleum than a home. But today felt different. Today, something had shifted inside me during the long hours of staring at that water-stained ceiling. Today, I wasn't just the woman in the basement anymore. Today, I remembered that I had choices. I wasn't always the invisible woman living in someone else's shadow. 43 years ago, I was Eleanor Patterson, a 25-year-old newlywed with dreams of raising a house full of children in a white picket fence neighborhood. My husband James was a good man, steady job at the phone company. Kind heart, gentle hands that could fix anything broken. We'd bought a little starter home with a mortgage that stretched our budget thin. But we were young and optimistic and absolutely certain that everything would work out perfectly. James died 3 years later when David was just 8 years old. Drunk driver ran a red light on a Tuesday afternoon, turned our world into a nightmare of funeral arrangements and insurance paperwork, and a little boy asking why Daddy wasn't coming home. The drunk driver walked away without a scratch. We never caught him. The police said these things happen like random acts of God instead of preventable tragedies caused by human selfishness. I was 28 years old, suddenly a widow with an 8-year-old son, a mortgage I couldn't afford, and a nursing degree I'd never actually used because James had wanted me to stay home with the baby. The life insurance barely covered the funeral costs. James's job benefits ended with his death. The house had to be sold to pay off the debts. Standing in that empty house on moving day, watching strangers carry away the furniture James had built with his own hands, I made a promise to myself and to David. My son would never want for anything I could provide, and I would never again put myself in a position where I depended on someone else for my basic survival. Those next 20 years were a blur of hospital shifts and overtime hours, of nursing school textbooks spread across the kitchen table after David went to bed, of falling asleep in my scrubs because I was too exhausted to change clothes. I worked at St. Mary's Hospital during the day, picked up weekend shifts at the urgent care clinic, and took on private duty nursing assignments whenever I could find them. While other women my age were dating and remarrying and building new lives with new husbands, I was at David's soccer games with grass stains on my white uniform shoes, helping with algebra homework between medication rounds, making sure my son knew he was loved and valued and never, ever a burden. Mom, David used to say when he was 12, wrapping his skinny arms around my waist after I'd worked a particularly brutal double shift, "When I grow up, I'm going to buy you the biggest house in the world, with a swimming pool and a library and a kitchen bigger than our whole apartment." I'd ruffle his hair, still soft and baby fine, even though he was trying so hard to be grown up, and tell him, "Just be happy, sweetheart. Just be a good person. That's all I need from you." But he did grow up to be successful, exactly the way I'd hoped and planned and sacrificed for. He got his engineering degree from State University. I still have the photographs from graduation day. Me crying in my best dress from JCPenney, him grinning in his cap and gown, both of us exhausted but triumphant. He landed an entry-level position at Morrison Tech, worked overtime and weekends, earned promotions and respect, and eventually a salary that seemed impossibly generous to someone who'd spent decades stretching every dollar until it screamed. When David was 25 and I was 53, I finally had enough saved for a down payment on a real house. Not the cramped apartments and rental duplexes we'd lived in since James died, but an actual house with a deed and equity, and rooms that belonged to us. David insisted on co-signing the mortgage application. though I qualified easily on my own by then. "Mom, let me help," he'd said, sitting across from me at the loan officer's desk. "After everything you've done for me, it's the least I can do." But when the paperwork was finalized, somehow only my name ended up on the deed. Eleanor Martin, sole owner. The loan officer said it was cleaner that way for tax purposes. And David had agreed it made sense. "It's your house, Mom. You earned it." Those were good years, the best years. David called every day, visited every weekend. We had traditions that felt sacred. Sunday dinners where I cooked his favorite pot roast and he told me about his work projects. Christmas morning coffee while we exchanged small, thoughtful gifts. Birthday celebrations where we'd look through photo albums and remember James together. David would bring dates to Sunday dinner. Sometimes, nice girls who seemed to understand that his mother was an important part of his life, who asked about my work at the hospital and complimented my cooking. I thought this was how it would always be. I thought I'd raised a son who understood loyalty and gratitude and love. Then, 3 years ago, David brought home Samantha. I knew the moment I met her that everything was about to change. It was at David's company Christmas party, held at the Marriott downtown. I'd bought a new dress for the occasion, navy blue with tiny pearl buttons. Conservative but elegant. David had been excited for me to meet her, talking about this amazing woman he'd been dating for 6 months, this brilliant marketing director who was different from anyone I've ever known. She was beautiful in that sharp, calculated way that requires both genetics and significant financial investment, perfect blonde hair that had clearly been professionally colored and styled, perfect white teeth that spoke of expensive orthodontics, perfect manicured nails painted the exact shade of red as her designer dress. Everything about her appearance was flawless and intentional, from her understated diamond earrings to her Italian leather shoes. When David introduced us, she extended one manicured hand for the briefest possible handshake and gave me what I came to think of as the smile lips curved upward, teeth visible, but absolutely no warmth reaching her pale blue eyes. "So you're David's mother," she said, her voice melodic but somehow condescending, as if I were an interesting artifact she was examining for authenticity. "He talks about you constantly. It's so sweet how close you two are. But even then, standing in that hotel ballroom with Christmas music playing and David beaming beside us, I could tell she was already mentally rearranging the furniture of our relationship. I could see her calculating, measuring, determining exactly how much space I would be allowed to occupy in her version of David's life. The changes started small and subtle. David began calling less frequently every other day instead of daily, then every few days, then weekly if I was lucky. Our sacred Sunday dinners became whenever we can make it work and then devolved into rushed coffee meetings when Samantha had other plans. When they got engaged after a year of dating, I learned about it from David's Facebook post rather than a phone call. "We wanted to tell everyone at once," David explained when I finally reached him. "Sam thought it would be easier to just post it online. The wedding planning was entirely Samantha's domain. I was consulted on nothing, not the venue, not the flowers, not even the guest list that somehow included very few of David's longtime friends or any of my relatives. I was invited to the bridal shower as an afterthought, the rehearsal dinner as a courtesy, and the wedding itself as a necessary obligation. I bought my own corsage, sat in the third row instead of the front, and felt like a stranger at my own son's wedding. But I told myself this was normal, the natural progression of life. Sons grow up, they start their own families, they create new traditions with their wives. The important thing was that David was happy, that he'd found someone who loved him, that he was building the kind of stable family life I'd always wanted him to have. I was still telling myself that lie when I fell last year. It was a stupid accident. The kind that happens to people my age when they stop paying attention to their limitations. I was changing a light bulb in my little studio apartment, the same apartment I'd been renting for 5 years, because I'd used most of my house proceeds to help David with his student loans and wedding expenses. The stepladder wobbled, my ankle twisted, and I went down hard onto the kitchen linoleum. The break was severe enough to require surgery and 8 weeks in a walking cast. Worse than the physical pain was the realization of how alone I'd become. I lay on that kitchen floor for 3 hours before my neighbor heard me calling for help. 3 hours, staring at the ceiling, wondering what would have happened if Mrs. Chen hadn't been home from her bridge game early. David was horrified when he got to the hospital. "Mom, you can't live alone anymore," he said, pacing around my emergency room bed like a caged animal. What if this had been worse? What if you'd hit your head? What if you'd fallen down the stairs instead of just off a stepladder? "I'm fine. Sweetheart, it's just a broken ankle. This time, but what about next time?" He sat down heavily in the plastic chair beside my bed, running his hands through his hair the way he'd done since he was little when he was worried or upset. "Mom, I want you to move in with us." The offer came so suddenly, so decisively, that I was caught completely off guard. "David, honey," I couldn't impose like that. "You and Samantha are newlyweds. You need your privacy." The house is huge, 4 bedrooms, 3 full bathrooms, a finished basement with its own entertainment area. We have plenty of space. He reached over and took my hand, squeezing gently around the IV tube taped to my knuckles. "Please, Mom, I need to know you're safe. I need to know someone's there if something happens." He was so earnest, so concerned, so much like the little boy who used to worry about me working late shifts at the hospital. How could I say no to that face? Those eyes that still looked at me like I was the most important person in his world. What does Samantha think about this idea? She's the one who suggested it, David said, and his answer was so quick, so confident, that I believed him completely. I should have known better. I should have recognized the difference between David's genuine emotion and Samantha's calculated planning. I should have asked more questions, demanded more details, insisted on a family meeting to discuss expectations and boundaries. But I was 67 years old, living alone in a studio apartment with a broken ankle and very limited savings. And my son was offering me a place in his beautiful home with people who loved me. Of course I said yes. The first month wasn't terrible. I stayed in what David called the guest room, a lovely space on the second floor with its own bathroom, large windows overlooking the backyard, and enough room for my bedroom furniture and a small sitting area. I tried to stay out of their way during the day, helped with cooking and cleaning when my ankle allowed, and genuinely believed we could make this arrangement work for everyone. But I started noticing things, small things at first, like the way Samantha would suggest I might be more comfortable eating in my room when they had friends over for dinner, the way she'd subtly change the subject when I joined conversations, or redirect questions that guests asked about my nursing career, the way she'd introduce me to neighbors not as David's mother, but as David's mother who's staying with us temporarily. Temporarily. That word began showing up in more and more of her sentences, always spoken with a bright smile but unmistakable intent, as if I were a house guest who'd overstayed my welcome rather than someone who'd been invited to make this my home. The breaking point came 4 months ago, on a Thursday evening in July that started like any other day and ended with me carrying my belongings down to the basement. I had been sitting in the living room, the room with the sectional sofa I'd helped David pick out, under the chandelier I'd given them as a housewarming gift, reading a mystery novel and enjoying the natural light from the large windows. It was about 6 o'clock, that peaceful time of evening when the day's heat was starting to fade and the whole house felt calm and welcoming. Samantha came home from work in what I'd learned to recognize as one of her moods. She dropped her purse on the kitchen counter with more force than necessary, kicked off her heels with sharp, angry movements, and poured herself a large glass of wine before acknowledging my presence. "Eleanor," she said, not bothering with hello or any other social pleasantries. We need to discuss your situation. I set down my book and looked at her carefully. In the 3 months I'd been living there, I'd learned to read the warning signs of these conversations. The tight set of her mouth, the way her eyes went cold and calculating, the particular tone of voice that suggested she'd been planning this discussion for days. What situation would that be? Dear, your living arrangement here. It's not working out the way we'd hoped when we invited you to stay. I'm sorry to hear that. What specifically isn't working? I've tried to respect your privacy, help with household tasks, stay out of your way during your social events. She waved one hand dismissively, as if my efforts were irrelevant. It's not about what you're doing, Eleanor. It's about your presence. You're just everywhere. David and I are trying to start our own family, trying to establish our own routines and traditions, and having you right there all the time is, she paused, searching for the right word, stressful. I felt something cold settle in my stomach. I could look for my own place again, if that would be better. Though I have to say, I'm surprised. David seemed so concerned about me living alone. Oh, no need for anything that drastic, she said quickly, too quickly, with that bright fake smile I'd learned to distrust. I've actually got a much better solution, something that will give you complete privacy and give us the space we need. That's when she led me downstairs to the basement, to the room they'd been using to store Christmas decorations and old furniture and David's college textbooks, and explained with enthusiastic detail how perfect it would be for someone in my situation. Look at all this space, she said, gesturing around the concrete-walled room like she was showing me a luxury suite, your own private area, completely separate from our living spaces. No noise from upstairs to bother you. No interruptions when you want to rest. And there's the utility sink right there if you need to wash anything. It's like having your own little apartment. An apartment with no windows, no natural light, no proper bathroom, and the constant smell of detergent and mildew. An apartment that was actually a storage room with concrete floors and pipes running across the ceiling. Samantha, I appreciate the thought, but I don't think this would be suitable for long-term living. There's no proper ventilation, no emergency exit. No. Oh, Eleanor, you worry too much. It's perfectly safe. And temporary, of course, just until we can figure out a more permanent solution for your housing needs. And when David came home 2 hours later and found me moving my clothes and personal items into cardboard boxes, when I looked at him with eyes that begged him to speak up, to defend me, to remember who I was and what I'd done for him, when I waited for him to say that this was unacceptable, that his mother deserved better, that we needed to find another solution, he looked at the floor, shuffled his feet like a guilty child, and said absolutely nothing. 3 months of nothing. 3 months of eating dinner alone in the basement while they entertained friends upstairs. 3 months of tiptoeing through my own house like an unwelcome intruder. 3 months of listening to Samantha tell people on the phone that they were managing the situation with David's mother until more appropriate arrangements could be made. 3 months of watching my son choose his wife's comfort over his mother's dignity, again and again and again. But here's what neither of them knew. What David had forgotten in all his years of taking my sacrifices for granted. I wasn't just some helpless old woman they were doing a favor for out of guilt and obligation. I was Eleanor Martin, and I owned every inch of the house above my head. Living in that basement wasn't just about the physical discomfort. Though that was considerable, the real torture was the way I became systematically erased from my own life, one small humiliation at a time. Take dinner time, which had once been sacred in our family. When David was growing up, no matter how exhausted I was from double shifts, no matter how much homework he had or how many activities were scheduled, we always ate dinner together. It was our time to connect, to share our days, to maintain the bond that had sustained us through all those difficult years. Now, I never knew if I was welcome at their table. Last Tuesday was typical. I came upstairs at 6:30. Having spent the afternoon in my basement cave reading nursing journals to keep my mind sharp and my certification current, the smell of something delicious was drifting from the kitchen Thai food, judging by the lemongrass and ginger scents that made my mouth water. I hadn't eaten since my morning toast, and I was looking forward to a real meal with actual conversation. Instead, I found David and Samantha sitting at the dining room table, the antique oak table I'd bought at an estate sale and lovingly refinished by hand during one of David's college summers. They were eating takeout from their favorite restaurant. 2 white containers open between them. 2 sets of wooden chopsticks. 2 glasses of white wine catching the light from the chandelier I'd given them as a wedding gift. Just 2, not 3. "Oh," Samantha said when she noticed me standing in the doorway, not even pausing in her methodical consumption of pad thai. "Eleanor, I didn't realize you were hungry." I stood there in the dining room of my own house, wearing the same cardigan I'd worn to work for 15 years before retirement. Feeling like I'd accidentally wandered into someone else's private moment, I just thought, "We usually eat around this time," I said, hating how small and uncertain my voice sounded. David looked up from his green curry, and for just a moment I saw something flicker across his face. Embarrassment, guilt, recognition of how this looked. But then Samantha reached over and touched his hand with one perfectly manicured finger. "Honey, remember what we discussed about maintaining healthy boundaries," she said, her voice gentle but pointed, about the importance of couple time. And just like that, the flicker in David's eyes died. "Mom," he said, still not quite meeting my gaze, "maybe it would be easier if you handled your own meal planning. We have such different schedules now." And Sam's right about needing some private time together. Different schedules. As if I were some random roommate with conflicting work hours, instead of the woman who had worked 3 jobs to put him through college, who had never missed a single one of his baseball games or science fairs or parent-teacher conferences. I made myself a peanut butter sandwich that night and ate it in the basement, listening to their laughter drift down through the heating ducts like some cruel soundtrack to my exile. They were discussing a vacation they were planning. A long weekend in Napa Valley to celebrate their 2nd anniversary. I hadn't even known their anniversary was coming up. This became our new normal over the following weeks. I'd venture upstairs, hopefully at mealtimes, only to find that they'd already eaten or ordered just enough for 2 people, or decided to go out to restaurants that somehow never had room for a 3rd person. I started keeping crackers and peanut butter in my basement room, eating like a college student or a prisoner, sustaining myself on whatever I could prepare without feeling like I was intruding on their domestic bliss. The social isolation was almost worse than the hunger when their friends came over, which happened frequently. Since Samantha was one of those people who saw entertaining as a competitive sport, I was systematically excluded from every gathering. "Eleanor, you probably want to have a quiet evening anyway," she'd say when I asked about joining them for dinner parties or game nights. "All that noise and chatter would just give you a headache. Or, I don't think you'd really enjoy this group. Eleanor, they're all young professionals. You'd probably be bored by their conversation." Or, most cutting of all, "It's really more of a couples thing. Eleanor, you'd feel out of place." So I'd retreat to the basement and listen to the sounds of laughter and conversation filtering down from above, imagining the scenes playing out in rooms I'd decorated and furnished myself. I'd hear the clink of glasses and the murmur of voices discussing careers and travel plans and current events, all the normal social interactions I'd been cut off from. Sometimes I'd recognize voices neighbors I'd known for years, colleagues of David's I'd met at company events, and wonder what they thought about my absence. Did they ask where I was? Did David and Samantha have a prepared explanation for why his mother was never around anymore? The physical boundaries they established were equally demoralizing. The main floor of the house which I'd thought of as our shared living space, gradually became off-limits territory. If I was reading in the living room when they came home, Samantha would suggest I might be more comfortable in my room. If I was watching television in the den, she'd remind me that they had some private business to discuss. If I was simply sitting at the kitchen island with my morning coffee, she'd bustle around me with pointed efficiency until I felt compelled to leave. "Eleanor, I need to prep for tonight's dinner party," she'd say, pulling out cutting boards and mixing bowls with theatrical urgency. "This kitchen is going to be chaos for the next few hours." Never mind that I'd cooked thousands of meals in that kitchen, that I knew where every pot and utensil was stored, that I could have helped with preparation if anyone had bothered to ask. I was treated like an obstacle to be navigated around rather than a potential resource or, God forbid, a family member who might enjoy being included. My own possessions began disappearing from common areas. The throw pillows I'd made for the living room sofa were replaced with ones that better matched Samantha's aesthetic vision. The family photos that had been displayed on the mantelpiece pictures of David's childhood, his graduation, our holidays together were quietly relocated to less prominent spots or removed entirely. My favorite coffee mug, the one David had given me for Mother's Day years ago, vanished from the kitchen cabinet and never reappeared. When I asked about it, Samantha looked genuinely puzzled. That old blue mug, I think it might have gotten chipped and thrown away. I can pick you up a new one at Target if you want. That old blue mug had been a treasured possession, irreplaceable not because of its material value, but because of the memory attached to it. David had been 12 years old when he bought it with his own allowance money. So proud of his ability to give me something that was entirely his choice. The mug had traveled with me through 3 apartment moves and countless early morning coffee rituals. It had been part of my daily routine for 15 years, but apparently it was just clutter to be discarded in the name of better kitchen organization. The breaking point came on my 68th birthday. I woke up that September morning with the cautious optimism that had sustained me through 40 years of disappointments and small triumphs. Surely, I thought, this would be different. Surely David wouldn't forget his mother's birthday, wouldn't let another year pass without some acknowledgement of the woman who'd given him life and raised him alone and sacrificed everything for his happiness. I was wrong. I came upstairs at 8 o'clock to find David and Samantha in the kitchen, already dressed for work, discussing their evening plans over coffee and bagels. The Hendersons confirmed for 7. Samantha was saying, scrolling through something on her phone, "I'll order from that new Mediterranean place on 5th Street. The lamb kebabs are supposed to be amazing." "Sounds perfect," David agreed, grabbing his travel mug and kissing her cheek. "I'll pick up wine on my way home." Neither of them looked at me as I shuffled into the kitchen in my robe and slippers, hoping for birthday wishes, or at least acknowledgement of my presence. "Good morning," I said, louder than necessary. "Oh, hi, Mom," David said distractedly, already heading toward the garage door. "Have a good day." And then he was gone, leaving me standing there with Samantha, who was still absorbed in her phone. "Samantha," I said carefully, "did David mention what day today is?" She glanced up briefly, then back to her screen. "Thursday." "Why? It's my birthday." For a moment, she looked genuinely surprised. Then her expression shifted to something that might have been embarrassment, or might have been irritation at having this complication introduced into her day. "Oh, well, happy birthday, Eleanor." That was it. No apology for the oversight. No suggestion that we should do something special to mark the occasion. No indication that this information changed any of their evening plans in the slightest. I spent that day wandering around the house like a ghost, touching surfaces and objects that had once been mine, remembering birthdays when David was small and would wake me up at dawn with homemade cards and breakfast in bed prepared with 8-year-old enthusiasm. When the Hendersons and their other guests arrived that evening, 8 people total. I counted the voices. I sat in my basement room listening to the celebration taking place directly above my head. They were using my china, the good set I'd saved for special occasions. They were sitting around my dining room table, drinking wine from glasses I'd carefully selected and purchased over the years. They were laughing and talking and celebrating in my house, in rooms I'd furnished and decorated and loved, while I sat alone in the basement eating a bologna sandwich for dinner. At 10:30, long after the guests had gone home, David finally came downstairs with a grocery store cupcake and a single candle. "Sorry, Mom," he said, holding out the pathetic little cake like it was some kind of peace offering. "Sam forgot it was your birthday until I mentioned it after everyone left." I stared at my son, my baby, the little boy I'd rocked to sleep and sung lullabies to and protected from every possible harm, and asked the question that had been burning in my chest for months. "David, do you even remember who I am anymore?" He fidgeted with the plastic container, looked everywhere except directly at my face. "Of course I do. Mom, you're my mother. Am I? Because your wife treats me like a piece of unwanted furniture she's trying to get rid of, and you just stand there and let her. It's not like that. Then what is it like? David, please, explain it to me. Explain how the woman who worked nights so you could have school clothes and lunch money gets pushed into a basement storage room while strangers eat birthday cake in her own dining room." The silence stretched between us, heavy with everything we weren't saying. I could see him struggling, see the conflict playing out behind his eyes. Part of him knew this was wrong. Part of him remembered the man I'd tried to raise him to be, but the larger part, the part that had been systematically trained by 3 years of marriage to prioritize his wife's comfort above all other considerations, won out. "Mom, you have to understand," he finally said, his voice quiet and defensive. "This is Sam's home too now. We have to think about what's best for our marriage. Our marriage, not our family. Our marriage, as if I were some external threat to their happiness instead of the person who'd made their current life possible." I looked at my son for a long moment, memorizing his face, trying to reconcile this weak, conflict-avoidant man with the boy who used to promise he'd take care of me when I got old. Then I nodded, blew out the single candle on my grocery store cupcake, and made a wish, not for things to get better, not for my son to rediscover his backbone, not for his wife to suddenly develop empathy or basic human decency. I wished for the strength to remember who I'd been before I became the woman in the basement. That night, I didn't cry myself to sleep for the first time in months. Instead, I lay awake thinking about the metal filing cabinet I'd brought from my apartment, the one shoved into the corner behind boxes of David's old textbooks and Samantha's out-of-season clothes, the cabinet that contained 40 years of important documents, including some papers I was pretty sure neither of them had ever seen or thought to ask about. Papers that might remind them both exactly who Eleanor Martin really was, and what she was capable of when pushed too far. The next morning, while David was at work and Samantha was at her Thursday yoga class, I pulled out the old metal filing cabinet and began methodically going through papers I hadn't touched in years. My fingers were trembling slightly from excitement or nervousness. I couldn't tell which as I opened the folder labeled Real Estate and Property Documents. There it was, exactly as I remembered it, preserved in a clear plastic sleeve, the original deed of trust for 1247 Maple Street, dated 15 years ago, Eleanor Martin. Sole owner. I read through it line by line, looking for any amendments, any transfer documents, any quitclaim deeds that might have changed the ownership structure since I'd moved in with David and Samantha. Nothing, not a single piece of paper that altered the fundamental fact that I, Eleanor Martin, was the sole legal owner of every square inch of this house, from the foundation to the roof shingles. I sat back on my heels, surrounded by manila folders and legal documents, and laughed out loud for the first time in months. It wasn't a happy laugh exactly, more like the sound someone makes when they realize they've been playing a game by rules that don't actually exist. David's name wasn't on the deed. It never had been. When we'd applied for the mortgage 15 years ago, the loan officer had suggested keeping the ownership simple for tax purposes, and David had agreed it made sense. "It's your house, Mom," he'd said at the time. "You earned it." Apparently, in all the years since then, in all the discussions about me moving in with them, neither David nor Samantha had bothered to verify the legal realities of what they were actually offering. They'd been treating me like a charity case, like some homeless relative they were graciously allowing to stay in their guest room out of the goodness of their hearts. But the truth was exactly the opposite. They had been living as my guests for 3 years, and somewhere along the way, all 3 of us had forgotten that fundamental fact. I flipped through the rest of the documents with growing amazement. Property tax statements, all in my name, homeowner's insurance policy, Eleanor Martin listed as the sole policy holder, utility bills that I'd been paying from my retirement account while assuming David was handling the household expenses. Even the homeowners association dues were being automatically deducted from my checking account. For 3 years, I had been financially supporting the very people who were treating me like an unwelcome burden. The next folder contained my life insurance policy, updated just 2 years ago when I'd moved out of my apartment, $800,000. With David listed as the sole beneficiary, I stared at that number for a long time, thinking about Samantha's recent comments about my health, her suggestions that I might be more comfortable in an assisted living facility, her frequent observations about how hard it must be for someone my age to live independently. Had she been waiting for me to die? Had she been calculating how much they'd inherit? How much easier their lives would be once the inconvenient old woman was out of the picture permanently? The possibility made my stomach turn. But it would explain so much. The systematic isolation, the gradual erasure of my presence from their daily lives, the way she spoke about my living situation as temporary with such confidence. Maybe she wasn't just trying to get rid of me. Maybe she was trying to speed up the timeline on her inheritance. The third folder held my bank statements and retirement account summaries. Not a fortune by modern standards, but enough to live independently and comfortably for many years to come. Enough to hire a lawyer, rent an apartment, start over somewhere else if I chose to. I'd been so focused on the emotional devastation of feeling unwanted that I'd forgotten I actually had options. But at the bottom of that folder, I found something even more valuable than financial independence. A business card collection spanning 40 years of professional relationships, names and numbers of people I'd worked with, helped, mentored, and supported over the decades of my nursing career. Margaret Wilson, attorney at law. We'd been colleagues at St. Mary's Hospital before she decided to go to law school at 35. She'd always said nursing had taught her to fight for people who couldn't fight for themselves, and the law was just another way to do that. Eleanor. She'd told me at her law school graduation, "If you ever need legal advice about anything, you call me. After all the times you covered my shifts when I had exams, it's the least I can do." Dr. Jennifer Chen, who now ran a successful internal medicine practice, but had started as a frightened young nursing student I'd taken under my wing during her clinical rotations. She'd send me a Christmas card every year with updates about her family and career, always including a note about how much my guidance had meant to her. And at the very bottom of the stack, written on a piece of paper that had yellowed with age, a phone number I'd kept for 25 years but never had reason to use. Tommy Rodriguez. The 12-year-old boy I'd taken in during the summer, David turned 15. Back when I was a single mother, barely managing my own life but unable to turn away a child who needed help. Tommy's grandmother had died suddenly. His uncle in California was scrambling to get custody paperwork sorted out, and social services needed temporary emergency placement for 6 weeks while the legalities were resolved. I can't pay you much. The caseworker had told me apologetically, and I know you're already struggling as a single parent, but he's a good kid, and he just needs somewhere safe to stay while his family gets organized. I'd looked at this skinny boy with enormous dark eyes and a garbage bag full of clothes, and I'd seen David at that age vulnerable, scared, needing someone to tell him he mattered. How could I say no? Those 6 weeks had turned into nearly 4 months. Tommy's uncle had been dealing with his own family crisis. The paperwork had gotten tangled in bureaucratic red tape, and I'd grown attached to the polite, studious boy who did his homework at my kitchen table and helped David with his summer reading assignments. When the uncle finally came to pick him up, all 3 of us had cried. I'll never forget this. Tommy had said, hugging me tight with 12-year-old desperation, "When I grow up, I'm going to pay you back somehow. Just be happy, sweetheart." I'd told him the same thing I always told David. Just be a good person. That's all I need. But he'd kept in touch over the years, sending Christmas cards and graduation announcements and updates about his life. High school honor roll, full scholarship to pre-med, medical school at Johns Hopkins, residency in cardiology. Last I'd heard, he was Dr. Tommy Rodriguez, practicing at a major hospital system about an hour north of here. He'd married another doctor, a pediatrician named Maria, and they were expecting their first child. I picked up my phone and dialed the number I'd memorized decades ago, hoping it still worked, hoping he'd remember the woman who'd given him a home when he needed one most. "Hello." The voice was deeper now, confident and professional, but I recognized it immediately. "Tommy, this is Eleanor Martin. I don't know if you remember me, but Mrs. Martin. Oh my God, of course I remember you. How could I forget? You saved my life that summer." The warmth in his voice, the genuine joy at hearing from me, made tears spring to my eyes. When was the last time someone had sounded that happy to talk to me? I was wondering if you might have a few minutes to talk. I'm in a difficult situation, and I could use some advice from someone I trust. Anything. "Mrs. Martin, tell me what's going on." So I did. I told him about David's marriage, about moving in with them after my accident, about the gradual isolation and systematic humiliation that had led to me living in their basement like some shameful secret. I told him about discovering the legal documents, about realizing I still owned the house they'd been treating as their own. "Jesus," he said when I finished, "Mrs. Martin, I'm so sorry. You don't deserve any of that treatment. What do you want to do about it?" "I think," I said slowly, the plan forming as I spoke, "I want to sell my house." There was a pause. Then, "Are you sure? That's a big decision. I've never been more sure of anything in my life." "Tommy, but I need to ask you something, and please feel free to say no. I know you and Maria are starting a family. Do you need a house?" Another pause, longer this time. I could hear him breathing, thinking. "Actually," he said finally, "we've been looking in that area. Maria's pregnant with our second baby, and we've outgrown our apartment. But Mrs. Martin, I want to be clear, if you're offering to sell to us, it has to be a fair market transaction. I won't take advantage of your situation. Tommy, sweetheart, paying me fair market value for my house isn't taking advantage. It's giving me exactly what I need, a way out of this situation and the resources to start over on my own terms." We talked for another hour, discussing practicalities and timelines and the emotional complexity of what I was planning. By the time I hung up, I had the beginnings of a plan that felt both terrifying and exhilarating. I called Margaret next, explaining the legal situation and asking about the process for selling a house when other people were living in it as unofficial tenants. She was outraged on my behalf and eager to help with the paperwork. "Eleanor, what they've been doing to you is elder abuse," she said bluntly. "Emotional abuse, financial exploitation, possibly even illegal eviction. You could sue them if you wanted to. I don't want to sue anyone. Maggie, I just want my life back. Then let's get you your life back. Over the next 2 weeks, I made quiet phone calls and gathered documents and prepared for a conversation I'd been avoiding for 3 months. Every time Samantha made a cutting remark about my temporary living situation, every time David failed to meet my eyes when she humiliated me in front of their friends, I reminded myself that in just a few more days, they'd understand exactly what temporary really meant. I also started packing, quietly and methodically. It was surprising how little I actually needed to take with me. Most of my furniture could stay with the house. Tommy and Maria would need it more than I would. My clothes, my books, my personal papers, my few pieces of meaningful jewelry, everything that actually mattered to me fit into 4 cardboard boxes and 2 suitcases. As I packed, I found myself remembering the woman I'd been before I became David's mother, before I became the invisible tenant in my own home, Eleanor Patterson, who'd been brave enough to marry for love at 25, Eleanor Martin, who'd rebuilt her life from nothing after James died, Eleanor Martin, who'd worked 3 jobs and still found time to help a homeless 12-year-old because it was the right thing to do. That woman wouldn't have accepted this treatment. That woman would have stood up for herself months ago. It was time to remember how to be her again. The night before, I planned to tell them everything. I sat in my basement room for the last time, surrounded by boxes and legal documents and the profound quiet that comes with making a decision that changes everything. I wasn't nervous anymore. I wasn't sad. I wasn't even angry. I was free. For the first time in 3 years, I was completely, utterly free. Tomorrow, David and Samantha would learn that the woman they'd been treating like a charity case actually held all the cards. Tomorrow, they'd discover that their comfortable assumptions about ownership and inheritance and my powerlessness had been built on a foundation of ignorance and wishful thinking. Tomorrow, Eleanor Martin was taking her life back. I called them into the living room at exactly 2 o'clock on Saturday afternoon, choosing the time deliberately. David would be relaxed from his morning golf game. Samantha would be in a good mood from her weekly spa appointment. And they'd both be unprepared for any kind of serious conversation. I wanted them comfortable and off guard when their world shifted beneath their feet. I'd arranged myself carefully in the wingback chair I'd bought when David was in high school. The chair I'd nursed him through chickenpox in, the chair where I'd helped him with college applications, the chair where I'd held my grandson during his brief visits before Samantha decided I was too stimulating for the baby. I had my folder of documents on the side table. Within easy reach, but not obviously threatening, David was sprawled on the sectional sofa, still wearing his golf clothes and scrolling through sports scores on his phone. Samantha was curled up beside him with her laptop, probably shopping for something expensive or planning their next social event. Neither of them looked particularly interested in talking to me, which was typical for our interactions these days. I have an announcement to make, I said, keeping my voice calm and conversational. Samantha didn't even look up from her screen. Eleanor, if this is about the basement arrangement again, we've already discussed it. The current situation is working fine for everyone. Is it for everyone? That got her attention. She closed the laptop and fixed me with the kind of patient, condescending smile she usually reserved for explaining simple concepts to particularly slow children. Yes, Eleanor, you have your privacy. We have our space. Everyone's needs are being met. It's a good compromise. Compromise suggests that both parties gave something up to reach an agreement. What exactly did you give up? Samantha. David shifted uncomfortably, sensing the change in my tone even if he couldn't identify what had caused it. Mom, what's this really about? You seem different today. I'm exactly the same person I've always been. David, the question is whether you remember who that person is. I reached for my folder and pulled out the first document. Let me ask you both something. Who do you think owns this house? The question hung in the air between us like a loaded weapon. I could see them exchanging glances, trying to figure out where this was going and how they should respond. "What kind of question is that?" Samantha asked, her voice taking on a defensive edge. "A simple one, a factual one. Who owns this house?" David cleared his throat, still looking puzzled but increasingly uncomfortable. "Well, I assumed when you moved in with us, you'd transferred ownership to me. For tax purposes or estate planning or whatever, that's what most people do in these situations. You assumed." I nodded thoughtfully. "And what about you?" "Samantha, what did you assume?" Her jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. The first crack in her composed facade. "I assumed this was David's house. Our house." "What exactly are you getting at?" "Eleanor." I held up the deed, making sure they could both see the official seal and legal formatting, even if they couldn't read the specific details from across the room. "This is the original deed of trust for this property, dated 15 years ago when the mortgage was first established. Would you like to see whose name is on it?" David leaned forward, his phone forgotten, and I could see genuine confusion in his eyes. "Mom, I don't understand what you're trying to prove here." I stood up and walked over to him, placing the document directly in his hands. "Read it. David, read the name on the ownership line." He took the deed with hands that were starting to tremble slightly, his eyes scanning the legal language until he found what he was looking for. I watched his face go pale as comprehension dawned. "Eleanor Martin, sole owner." He read aloud, his voice barely above a whisper. "That's correct. Sole owner, not joint owner with my son, not former owner who transferred the property, as current, legal, undisputed sole owner of every square inch of this house and the land it sits on." Samantha jumped to her feet, her composure finally cracking completely. "That's impossible." "David, you've been paying the mortgage, haven't you? You've been handling all the household expenses. There is no mortgage," I said calmly, enjoying the shock that flashed across both their faces. "I paid this house off completely 10 years ago, using the proceeds from the sale of my previous home and my retirement savings. For the past 3 years, I've been paying property taxes, homeowners insurance, utility bills, and maintenance costs out of my personal accounts while you've been living here as my guests." The silence that followed was so complete I could hear the grandfather clock ticking in the hallway, the hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen, the distant sound of children playing in the neighborhood where I'd once thought I'd spend my golden years surrounded by family. "Now," I continued, settling back into my chair with the satisfaction of a chess player who just revealed a winning strategy, "I have some news that I think you'll find interesting. I've decided to sell the house." "What?" David rocketed to his feet, the deed fluttering to the floor between us. "Mom, you can't be serious. This is our home." "Whose home?" "David, according to the legal documents, it's my home. You've been living here as my guest for 3 years. Though I understand the arrangement may have been unclear to both of you." Samantha's face had gone from pale to flushed, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. "You can't do this." "We have rights. We've been living here. We've invested in this place. We have equity." "What equity would that be, Samantha?" I asked, genuinely curious about her reasoning. "Show me one receipt for a mortgage payment with your name on it. Show me one property tax statement you've paid, one homeowner's insurance premium, one major repair or improvement you've funded out of your own pocket." She opened her mouth, then closed it again, clearly struggling to come up with a response that wouldn't reveal the extent of her financial assumptions about my property. "We've been maintaining the house," she said finally. "We've been taking care of it, improving it. Have you, let's see, in the 3 years you've lived here, I can think of exactly 2 improvements. The master bathroom renovation you're planning, which will be funded by your personal savings and benefit only your private living space, and the kitchen backsplash you installed last year, which cost $300 and was done primarily because you didn't like my original tile choice. I paused, letting that sink in. Meanwhile, I've paid for a new roof, Shviak maintenance, plumbing repairs, lawn care, pest control, and approximately $40,000 in routine maintenance and upgrades. David sank back onto the sofa, his head in his hands. Jesus, Mom, I didn't know. I thought we were helping you by letting you live here. Letting me live here. I repeated the phrase slowly, tasting the irony. David, you've been letting me live in my own house, in a basement storage room, while treating me like an unwelcome charity case. But the buyer, Samantha interrupted, clearly trying to regain control of the conversation. You said you found a buyer. Who would buy a house with tenants already living in it? Any real estate agent would tell you that's problematic. I smiled at her, the first genuine smile I'd directed her way in months. The buyer is Dr. Tommy Rodriguez. He's a cardiologist, married to a pediatrician, expecting their second child. They need a house in this school district, and they've offered fair market value. Tommy Rodriguez. David frowned, the name tugging at some distant memory. Why does that sound familiar? He's the boy I took in when you were 15. David. I suppose you might not remember him clearly. You were busy with your own teenage life at the time, which was perfectly appropriate. But Tommy remembers what it meant to have someone offer him a home when he needed one most. I let that statement hang in the air for a moment, watching comprehension dawn on David's face as he realized what I was really saying. Tommy grew up to become exactly the kind of man I hoped he would. I continued. Successful, caring, grateful for the help he received, and eager to pay it forward. When I called him last week and explained my situation, his first concern was whether I was being treated with the respect and dignity I deserve. His second concern was how he could help me regain my independence. You've been planning this, Samantha said, her voice tight with fury and something that might have been panic. You've been plotting behind our backs, manipulating the situation. I've been protecting myself, I corrected her, something I should have done months ago, but I kept hoping that the son I raised would remember his values and stand up for what's right. I kept believing that love and loyalty meant something in this family. David looked up at me with red-rimmed eyes, and for a moment I saw the little boy I'd raised alone, the child who used to crawl into my bed during thunderstorms and promise he'd always take care of me. Mom, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I should have protected you. I should have stopped this from happening. Yes, you should have, but you didn't. You chose your wife's comfort over your mother's dignity again and again and again. You chose peace in your marriage over doing what was right. Those were choices. David, you made them consciously every single day for 3 months. But this is extreme. Don't you think? Samantha had found her voice again, though it sounded strained and desperate. Selling the house, throwing us out, it's emotional manipulation. You're upset about the living arrangements. But destroying our lives isn't the answer. Destroying your lives. I stood up again, and for the first time in months, I felt like I was reclaiming my full height, my full presence in my own home. Samantha, let me tell you about destroyed lives. A destroyed life is working double shifts for 20 years so your child can go to college debt-free. A destroyed life is giving up every opportunity for companionship and remarriage because your son needs stability and support. A destroyed life is sacrificing your own dreams and desires for decades because you believe that love requires sacrifice. I walked closer to her, close enough to see the fear that was finally showing in her pale blue eyes. A destroyed life is discovering that all that sacrifice meant nothing to the person you made it for. A destroyed life is being treated like a burden and an inconvenience by people who owe their current comfort to your years of financial and emotional support. A destroyed life is being pushed into a basement storage room by a woman who sees you as nothing more than an obstacle to her inheritance expectations. Inheritance. Samantha's voice cracked on the word. What are you talking about? I returned to my chair and pulled out the life insurance policy, holding it up so she could see the official letterhead and policy numbers. $800,000. Samantha, that's what David inherits when I die. According to my current life insurance policy. Did you know about this when you married him? Is that why you've been so concerned about my health lately? So worried about how temporary my living situation should be? Her face went white, then red, then white again. You never what? Never thought about it. Never calculated how much easier your lives would be once the inconvenient old woman was out of the picture permanently. Never mentioned to your friends how difficult it is to deal with elderly relatives and their health issues. David was staring at his wife with an expression I'd never seen before, a combination of horror and recognition that suggested he was finally seeing her clearly for the first time. Sam, he said quietly, tell me you haven't been waiting for my mother to die. Of course not, she protested, but her voice lacked conviction. That's a horrible thing to suggest. I just thought we deserved our own space, our own life, without constant interference from the woman who owns the house you're living in. I finished. From the woman whose financial support has made your comfortable lifestyle possible. From the woman who raised the man you claim to love. I gathered my documents and stood up, suddenly exhausted by the whole confrontation, but also exhilarated by the freedom that came with finally telling the truth. You have 30 days to find alternative housing, I said, my voice steady and final. Tommy and Maria will take possession on November 1st. I'll be moving out next week. Where will you go? David asked, and I heard something in his voice that might have been genuine concern, or might have been panic at the realization that his inheritance expectations had just evaporated. I've rented a 2-bedroom condo in Riverside Gardens. It's a lovely senior community with a pool and a library and neighbors who actually enjoy my company. I'm also going back to work part-time at St. Mary's Hospital. They're desperate for experienced nurses. Even ones my age. Samantha found her voice one last time, her composure completely shattered. You're 68 years old. You can't just start over. You can't just throw away your family. I looked at her for a long moment. This woman who had systematically dismantled my relationship with my son, who had made me feel unwelcome in my own home, who had treated me like a shameful secret to be hidden away. Samantha, I said gently, I'm not throwing away my family. I'm walking away from people who forgot that I was part of it. And as for starting over, I did that once before when I was 28, with an 8-year-old son and nothing but a nursing degree and a determination to survive. Starting over at 68 with my own savings, my own property sale proceeds, my own choices about how to spend my time. That's not starting over. That's finally living free. I walked toward the stairs that led to my basement room, then turned back one final time. Oh, and David, you can reach me at my new phone number after I move. I'm changing everything: phone, address, email, emergency contacts. I think it's time I stopped waiting for calls that never come and started building relationships with people who actually want me in their lives. As I headed down those basement stairs for what I hoped would be the last time, I heard Samantha's voice rise to a near shriek. Do something. David, stop her. Don't let her ruin everything. And David's response, quiet and defeated, but finally honest. How can I stop her? Sam, she's right about everything. We've been living in her house, spending her money, and treating her like garbage. How can I stop her when she's absolutely right? It was the first time in 3 years I'd heard my son tell his wife she was wrong about something. It was a start. 2 weeks later, I stood in the driveway of 1247 Maple Street for the last time, watching Tommy Rodriguez carry his 2-year-old daughter Isabella across the threshold of what used to be my house. His wife, Maria, glowing with 6 months of pregnancy, was directing the movers with the kind of excited energy that comes with finally having a real home for your growing family, Mrs. Martin, Tommy said, walking back to where I stood beside the moving truck, his eyes bright with emotion. I can't thank you enough, not just for the house, but for everything, for showing me what home could feel like when I thought I'd never have one again. I hugged him tight. This boy I'd raised for 6 months who'd grown into a man worth knowing and respecting. You already thanked me 25 years ago, sweetheart, by becoming the person you are, by remembering that kindness matters, by being the kind of man who calls a lonely old woman back and offers to help instead of making excuses. You're not old, Maria protested, joining us with Isabella on her hip. And you're definitely not lonely anymore. That condo complex sounds amazing. And going back to nursing, you're going to love having a purpose again. She was right about the purpose. St. Mary's Hospital had welcomed me back with enthusiasm that bordered on desperation, apparently. Experienced nurses willing to work part-time with difficult patients were in short supply. I'd be starting Monday in the cardiac recovery unit, helping patients and families navigate the frightening world of heart surgery and rehabilitation. It felt like coming home to myself after 3 years of exile. David and Samantha had moved out 3 days earlier, their departure marked by cold efficiency and barely contained hostility. The divorce papers had been filed within a week of our confrontation. Apparently, Samantha's love proving less durable than her expectations about real estate inheritance. When she realized that David would be inheriting nothing but his own debt and a studio apartment in a less fashionable part of town, her commitment to their marriage evaporated like morning mist. David had helped me move my belongings to the condo, and I'd let him. It was awkward and painful, full of conversations we didn't have and apologies that came too late. But he'd shown up, he'd carried boxes, assembled furniture, and when we were done, he'd sat at my new kitchen table and cried like the little boy I remembered. I don't know how to make this right. Mom, he'd said through his tears, I failed you so completely. I failed at the most basic thing protecting my mother, honoring the woman who gave me everything. I'd poured us both coffee from my new coffee maker in my new kitchen, and sat across from him at the small round table I'd chosen, specifically because it was too small for anyone to feel excluded or relegated to the far end. You can't make it right. David, I'd told him honestly, what's done is done. The trust is broken. The relationship is damaged. And pretending otherwise won't fix anything. But you can learn from it. You can choose to be a different man going forward. How do I learn to be better when I failed so completely at something so basic? I'd reached across the table and taken his hand, still my son's hand, still the little boy I'd raised alone, but now belonging to a man who needed to figure out who he wanted to be. You learn by remembering that love isn't a feeling. It's a choice you make every single day. You chose Samantha's comfort over my dignity. You chose peace in your marriage over standing up for what was right. You chose the easy path over the moral path, again and again. Those were choices. David, you can make different ones next time. Will there be a next time? Can you? Is forgiveness possible? I'd squeezed his hand, feeling the calluses from his weekend golf games and his desk job, remembering when those hands were small enough to hold completely in mine. I've already forgiven you. Sweetheart, forgiveness isn't something you earn. It's something I choose to give, because holding on to anger would poison my new life. But forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting, and it doesn't mean going back to the way things were. It means moving forward with clear eyes and realistic expectations. He'd nodded, understanding more than I'd expected him to. I love you, Mom. I know I didn't show it, but I do love you. I know you do. That was never the question. The question was whether you loved me enough to act like it when it mattered. 6 months have passed since that conversation, and I'm writing this from my sunlit living room in Riverside Gardens, looking out at the small garden I've started on my balcony. Tomatoes and herbs, flowers that attract butterflies, a small lemon tree that probably won't survive the winter but gives me joy while it lasts. My days are full in ways they haven't been for years. 3 mornings a week, I'm at the hospital, helping cardiac patients navigate their recovery and teaching younger nurses the skills that come only with decades of experience. 2 afternoons a week, I volunteer at the women's shelter downtown, helping women who've lost their homes and their families rediscover their strength and independence. I tell them what I learned the hard way. Sometimes the only way to find yourself is to walk away from people who've forgotten who you are. The other residents here at Riverside Gardens have become the social circle I didn't realize I was missing. Margaret Wilson lives 2 buildings over, and we have coffee every Tuesday morning, sharing gossip and legal advice and the comfortable friendship of women who've survived their share of disappointments. Dr. Jennifer Chen visits monthly with her family, bringing her children to help with my garden and staying for dinner, because she says I remind her of the grandmother she lost too young. David calls every Sunday now, a tradition we've established slowly and carefully over the past 6 months. We talk about his therapy sessions, his new apartment, his process of figuring out who he wants to be when he's not trying to please someone who doesn't deserve his loyalty. Last week, he asked if he could come for dinner. I'd like that, I told him, but David, understand something clearly. You come to my home as my guest, not as my son expecting to reclaim his birthright. We build this relationship from scratch, with mutual respect and honest communication. Or we don't build it at all. I understand, he'd said, his voice steadier than I'd heard it in years. And Mom, thank you. For what? For showing me it's never too late to find your backbone. I laughed at that, surprised by the sudden lightness in my chest. Oh, honey, I never lost my backbone. I just forgot I was allowed to use it tonight. I'm having dinner with my book club 7 women between the ages of 62 and 79 who've read everything from Jane Austen to Toni Morrison and aren't afraid to argue about character motivation over wine and cheese. Tomorrow morning, I'm teaching a quilting class at the Community Center for women who want to learn traditional crafts. Next weekend, Tommy and Maria are bringing Isabella and baby Miguel over for brunch. A monthly tradition that's become one of my greatest joys. My calendar is full of people who see me as Eleanor Martin friend, mentor, colleague, woman, not just as someone's mother or someone's burden or someone's inconvenient obligation. I'm not the woman who lived in that basement anymore. I'm not even the woman who sacrificed everything for an ungrateful child. Though I don't regret loving David or raising him to the best of my ability, those experiences shaped me, but they don't define me. I'm Eleanor Martin, 68 years old, living in a home I chose, surrounded by people who value my presence, working at a job that uses my skills and experience, building a life that belongs entirely and completely to me. Some people might say I was too harsh with David and Samantha, that I should have tried harder to work things out. That family means forgiving everything and accepting any treatment in the name of love. But I've learned that forgiveness doesn't require you to accept unacceptable behavior. Love doesn't mean disappearing yourself to make room for someone else's comfort. Kindness doesn't mean allowing yourself to be diminished or disrespected. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do for yourself and for the people who've forgotten how to see you is to walk away with your dignity intact and let them figure out what they've lost. I'm not waiting by the phone anymore, hoping for calls that might never come. I'm not shrinking myself to fit into spaces too small for my spirit. I'm not apologizing for taking up room in my own life or making my own choices or demanding the respect that every human being deserves. I'm 68 years old, and I'm finally, fully, completely free and it feels like coming home to the woman I was always meant to be before I became someone's mother, before I became someone's burden, before I forgot that Eleanor Martin was worth fighting for. The woman in the basement is gone forever. In her place stands a woman who knows her worth, who demands respect, who chooses her own path forward, regardless of what others expect or demand. I learned that it's never too late to remember who you are beneath all the roles you've played for other people. It's never too late to stand up and say enough when you're being treated as less than you deserve. It's never too late to choose yourself, especially when the people you love have forgotten to choose you. Some mornings I wake up in my bright, cheerful bedroom and remember that basement room with something almost like gratitude, not because I enjoyed the experience, but because it taught me something essential about my own strength. It showed me that I could survive anything, that I could lose everything I thought I needed and still find a way to build something better. The house at 1247 Maple Street was never really mine, not in the way that mattered. It was a place I owned legally, but it had become a prison I shared with people who saw me as an obstacle rather than a gift. My real home turned out to be wherever I could live with dignity, surrounded by people who appreciate my presence rather than tolerate it. David and I are slowly building something new, not the relationship we used to have, which was built on his dependence and my sacrifice, but something more honest and equal. He's learning to see me as a complete person rather than just his mother, and I'm learning to love him without losing myself in the process. It's harder work than either of us expected, but it's real in a way our old relationship never was. Last month, when he came for our monthly dinner, he brought a small framed photo, a picture of us from his college graduation, both of us beaming with pride and hope for the future. "I want you to know," he said, setting it on my bookshelf next to pictures of my new friends and my volunteer work, "that I remember who you were before I forgot to see you. I remember the woman who worked nights so I could have everything I needed. I remember the mother who never missed a single game or recital or parent conference. No matter how tired she was, I remember the person who taught me that love means action, not just words." He paused, looking at the photo, then at me. I forgot those lessons for a while, but I'm trying to remember them now. I'm trying to become the man you raised me to be. That's all anyone can do. I told him, try to be better tomorrow than you were today, tonight. As I sit in my own living room, in my own chair, reading my own book by my own choice, I think about all the women who might be reading this story while sitting in their own metaphorical basements. Women who've been made to feel like burdens by people who should treasure them. Women who've been convinced that asking for respect or dignity or basic human decency is somehow selfish or unreasonable. If you're one of those women, let me tell you something important. You are not too old to start over. You are not too set in your ways to demand better treatment. You are not responsible for managing other people's emotions at the expense of your own well-being. You have choices, even when it doesn't feel like it. You have worth, even when others have forgotten to see it. You have the right to take up space in your own life, to make decisions based on your own needs, to walk away from situations and people who diminish your spirit. It's scary to choose yourself when you've spent decades choosing others first. It's terrifying to risk loneliness in exchange for dignity, but I can tell you from experience that the loneliness of being ignored and disrespected is far worse than the solitude of living authentically. I am Eleanor Martin. I am 68 years old. I survived widowhood and single motherhood and financial struggle and family betrayal and systematic emotional abuse. I survived all of that, and I came out stronger on the other side. Not because I'm extraordinary, but because I finally remembered that I am enough, just as I am right now, without needing to justify my existence or minimize my needs or apologize for taking up space in the world. The woman in the basement learned to live small, to speak quietly, to accept whatever scraps of affection and respect were offered. But Eleanor Martin, she lives large, speaks her truth, and accepts nothing less than the fully, complete, unrestricted freedom to be herself. And that, it turns out, is everything